In 1922, a bankrupt soft drink company called Pepsi Cola offered to sell itself to the Coca-Cola company. Coca-Cola said no. In 1923, Pepsi went bankrupt again and made the same offer. Coca-Cola said no again. In 1933, one more time, Pepsi came to Coca-Cola with its hand out, and for the third time, Coca-Cola turned them down. It is the most expensive rejection in the history of American business, because that dying brand would spend the next 90 years making Coca-Cola's life absolutely miserable. This is the story of the longest corporate war ever fought. Not a war over territory or resources, but over something far more abstract, which brown, carbonated sugar water you choose to put in your mouth. It sounds trivial. It is not. The Coca-Cola brand alone is valued at over $80 billion. The decisions made in this rivalry have shaped how every consumer product on Earth is marketed, sold, and defended. Two pharmacists, two drugstores, 130 years of psychological warfare, stolen secrets, exploding hair, and the single worst product launch in marketing history. And somehow, after all of it, neither side has ever managed to win. The story starts in a pharmacy. It almost always does. It's in 1886, a pharmacist named John Stith Pemberton was working in Atlanta, Georgia. Like many pharmacists of his era, Pemberton was experimenting with tonics and patent medicines. On May 8th of that year, he brought a new syrup to Jacob's Pharmacy in downtown Atlanta, where it was mixed with carbonated water and sold for 5 cents a glass. His bookkeeper, Frank Robinson, came up with the name based on two of its ingredients, coca leaf and cola nut. He called it Coca-Cola, and he wrote it out in the flowing cursive script that is still the company's logo today. In its first year, Coca-Cola sold about 9 glasses a day. Pemberton was not a businessman. He was a tinkerer, a chemist. And in 1888, dying and desperate for money, he sold the rights to Coca-Cola to an Atlanta entrepreneur named Asa Griggs Candler for approximately $2,300. Pemberton died that same year. He never saw what happened next. What Pemberton left behind was more than a recipe. He left a mystery. The original Coca-Cola formula contained extracts of coca leaf and cola nut, along with sugar, caramel, and a blend of essential oils. For over a century, the exact proportions have been one of the most closely guarded trade secrets in business. The formula is reportedly kept in a vault at the World of Coca-Cola Museum in Atlanta. Only 2 executives are said to know the complete recipe at any given time, and they are reportedly not allowed to travel on the same airplane. Whether this is true or simply part of the mythology, it has done exactly what Coca-Cola intended. It turned a drink into a legend. Candler was the opposite of Pemberton. He was a relentless marketer. He distributed free coupons for glasses of Coca-Cola. He plastered the brand name on calendars, clocks, and soda fountain urns. He created the distribution system that would make Coca-Cola a national product. By 1904, the company was selling 20 million gallons a year. In 1915, Coca-Cola introduced the contour bottle, designed so that you could recognize it by touch in the dark or identify it from a broken piece on the ground. In 1916, Candler sold the Coca-Cola company for $25 million. It was one of the largest transactions in American business at the time. 7 years later, a man named Robert Woodruff became president of Coca-Cola. He would hold that position for 34 years, and he had one vision that defined everything. Coca-Cola should be within an arm's reach of desire everywhere on Earth. Under Woodruff, Coca-Cola went global, and then the Second World War gave him the perfect opportunity. Woodruff convinced the U.S. military to supply Coca-Cola to American soldiers wherever they were stationed. The company built 64 bottling plants near the front lines. By the end of the war, Coca-Cola was in 44 countries. By the time Woodruff stepped down in 1954, it was in over 130 countries, and Coca-Cola held 60% of the entire cola market. The bottling system was Coca-Cola's real innovation. Candler had sold the bottling rights for just $1 in 1899, a deal that seemed trivial at the time but created a network of independent bottlers across the country who had financial incentive to push the product as hard as possible. By the time Woodruff took over, this bottling network had become an empire within an empire. Each bottler was essentially a franchise, investing their own capital to distribute Coca-Cola in their territory. It was a decentralized army, and it gave Coca-Cola reach that no competitor could match. During the war, Woodruff's arrangement with the U.S. military was not just patriotic, it was strategic. Every soldier who drank Coca-Cola overseas became an ambassador for the brand when they came home. And the 64 bottling plants that Coca-Cola built near the front lines did not close when the war ended. They became the foundation of the company's international distribution network. Coca-Cola went to war as an American brand and came back as a global one. It looked unbeatable. It looked permanent. Meanwhile, 7 years after Pemberton mixed his first batch, another pharmacist in another drugstore was doing the exact same thing. In 1893, Caleb Bradham was running a pharmacy in New Bern, North Carolina. He created a fountain drink and called it Brad's Drink. In 1898, he renamed it Pepsi-Cola. The Pepsi came from dyspepsia, the medical term for indigestion, because Bradham advertised the drink as a digestive aid. The parallels are strange. Two pharmacists, two drugstores, two cola drinks created 7 years apart. But where their stories diverge is what makes this rivalry so fascinating. Bradham tried to grow Pepsi-Cola into a national brand. By 1909, he had the first celebrity endorsement in Pepsi history when race car driver Barney Oldfield called it a bully drink, refreshing, invigorating, a fine bracer before a race. But Bradham made a catastrophic bet. He speculated heavily on sugar prices during the volatile years after World War I. When the prices collapsed, so did Pepsi-Cola. In 1923, the company declared bankruptcy. And this is where Coca-Cola made its historic mistake. Pepsi approached Coca-Cola to sell. Coca-Cola said no. They thought Pepsi was finished. They were wrong. Pepsi's second life began with spite. A candy manufacturer named Charles Guth was the president of Loft Inc., which ran a chain of stores with soda fountains. Guth asked Coca-Cola for a volume discount on syrup. Coca-Cola refused, so Guth, out of pure retaliation, bought the bankrupt Pepsi-Cola brand and had his chemists reformulate the syrup. He replaced Coca-Cola with Pepsi at every single one of his soda fountains. Then, in 1934, Guth made the move that changed everything. While Coca-Cola was selling 6.5 ounces for a nickel, Guth started selling Pepsi in 12-ounce bottles. For the same nickel, twice the cola, same price. During the Great Depression, when every penny mattered, this was not just a pricing strategy, it was a declaration of war. In 1940, Pepsi recorded what may be the most effective radio jingle in advertising history. The Tune Twisters sang, "Pepsi-Cola hits the spot, 12 full ounces, that's a lot. Twice as much for a nickel, too. Pepsi-Cola is the drink for you." The melody was designed to loop endlessly. Once you heard it, it never left your head. Between 1936 and 1938, Pepsi's profits doubled. There is a legal footnote worth mentioning. Guth had used Loft's money and facilities to build Pepsi into a success while the Loft candy business was failing. Loft sued Guth for ownership of Pepsi-Cola. The case went all the way to the Delaware Supreme Court. Guth lost. Pepsi-Cola now belonged to Loft. It was a messy birth for a brand that would become worth billions. In the 1940s, Pepsi did something that no major American corporation had ever tried. It marketed directly to black consumers. Walter Mack, who became Pepsi's president during the war years, recognized something that the rest of corporate America was ignoring. African Americans were a massive, untapped market. Most white-owned companies either excluded black consumers from their advertising entirely or depicted them using offensive stereotypes. In 1947, Mack hired Edward F. Boyd to lead a 12-man, all-black sales team. Boyd created advertising that showed black Americans in dignified, aspirational settings. One campaign, titled Leaders in Their Fields, profiled prominent African Americans like Nobel Peace Prize winner Ralph Bunche and photographer Gordon Parks. Another famous ad showed a smiling mother holding a six-pack of Pepsi while her young son reached up for a bottle. That boy was Ron Brown, who would grow up to become the United States Secretary of Commerce. Boyd's team traveled the country promoting Pepsi at churches, schools, community centers, and jazz concerts. They got Duke Ellington and Lionel Hampton to promote Pepsi from the stage. But they also faced the reality of 1940s America. Jim Crow laws were still in force. Boyd's team encountered insults from their own coworkers at Pepsi, and death threats from the Ku Klux Klan. They used the hostility as a weapon. Pepsi's team attacked Coca-Cola's reluctance to hire black employees and pointed to the Coca-Cola chairman's support for Georgia's segregationist governor, Herman Talmadge. The result was dramatic. African American consumers became 3 times more likely to buy Pepsi than Coke. After Boyd's team visited Chicago, Pepsi's market share in the city overtook Coca-Cola's for the first time. It was one of the first examples of what we would now call niche marketing, and Pepsi did it decades before the rest of corporate America caught on. The significance of this moment extends beyond marketing. In the 1940s and 1950s, most American corporations treated African Americans as invisible consumers. Pepsi not only acknowledged them but treated them with dignity in its advertising. Boyd's sales team operated in an era when a black man in a business suit knocking on doors in the American South could be risking his life. The courage required was extraordinary, and the business results validated their approach completely. Coca-Cola, by contrast, was slow to recognize the African American market. The company's ties to the Southern establishment made it reluctant to challenge the racial status quo. This gap in marketing strategy gave Pepsi a loyal consumer base that persisted for decades. It also demonstrated a principle that both companies would learn over and over. The most powerful marketing strategies are the ones that see customers as people, not demographics. By 1950, Coca-Cola was outselling Pepsi 5-1. Pepsi was still seen as the cheap option, the brand that sat in your kitchen but never made it to the parlor. Alfred Steele changed that. As Pepsi's new leader in the 1950s, he shifted the brand's positioning from economy to quality. He lowered the sugar content slightly to make the taste less aggressively sweet. His wife, the actress Joan Crawford, became a Pepsi spokeswoman, lending the brand a touch of Hollywood glamour. Crawford would eventually join Pepsi's board of directors. But the real transformation came in the 1960s, when Pepsi launched the Pepsi Generation campaign. Instead of selling a drink, Pepsi sold an identity. Coca-Cola was your grandfather's drink, the nostalgia brand with Santa Claus and polar bears. Pepsi was for young people, for the new generation. It was one of the most effective repositioning campaigns in marketing history, and it cut to the heart of Coca-Cola's vulnerability. Its own success had made it seem old. The transformation was not just about advertising. It was about understanding a generational shift that Coca-Cola could not see because it was too invested in its own mythology. Coca-Cola's brand was built on tradition, on the idea that things should stay the same. That worked when the culture valued stability, but the 1960s were about revolution, about rejecting what your parents believed. Pepsi understood this instinctively. They did not try to compete with Coca-Cola's history. They made history seem like a disadvantage. The Pepsi Generation campaign ran in various forms for over 2 decades. It evolved from a simple youth marketing strategy into a complete brand philosophy. When you bought Pepsi, you were not buying a drink. You were making a statement about who you were and what you believed in. Coca-Cola, for all its marketing brilliance, had no answer to this. You cannot suddenly make a 100-year-old brand feel young. The more they tried, the more they looked like a parent trying to use their teenager's slang. The gap narrowed rapidly. By 1980, Coca-Cola's lead had shrunk from 5-1 to just 1.5-1. In supermarkets, Pepsi was already outselling Coke, and Pepsi's CEO, Donald Kendall, had built a relationship with Richard Nixon that put Pepsi machines in the White House cafeteria. Then, in 1974, Pepsi achieved something genuinely remarkable. It became the first American consumer product to be produced, marketed, and sold inside the Soviet Union, a barter deal. American cola for Soviet vodka. Pepsi had cracked a market that Coca-Cola, despite its global reach, had not been able to enter. The Soviet deal deserves its own telling. In 1959, at a trade exhibition in Moscow, Vice President Richard Nixon offered Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev a cup of Pepsi. The photograph of Khrushchev drinking Pepsi became one of the most famous images of the Cold War. Donald Kendall, who was running Pepsi's international operations at the time, had orchestrated the moment. It was a masterpiece of corporate diplomacy. The formal deal came in 1974. Because the Soviet Union did not have convertible currency, Pepsi agreed to a barter arrangement. Pepsi syrup in exchange for Stolichnaya vodka distribution rights in the United States. Pepsi was literally trading cola for vodka across the Iron Curtain. By the late 1980s, the arrangement had expanded so dramatically that the Soviet Union was trading naval vessels, including submarines, to PepsiCo as part of the deal. For a brief moment, PepsiCo had the 6th largest naval fleet in the world. Coca-Cola would not enter the Soviet market until after the fall of the Berlin Wall. By then, Pepsi had a 15-year head start. It was one of the few times in the rivalry where Pepsi was genuinely first to a major market. In 1975, Pepsi launched the campaign that would push Coca-Cola to the brink. The Pepsi challenge was simple. At malls and shopping centers across America, a Pepsi representative set up a table with 2 unmarked white cups. One contained Pepsi, one contained Coca-Cola. People were asked to taste both and say which they preferred. The answer, more often than not, was Pepsi. It was brilliant marketing. It was also not science. Malcolm Gladwell, in his 2005 book Blink, pointed out a critical flaw. People tend to prefer sweeter drinks in a single sip. But drinking an entire can is different from taking one taste. There was also the issue of the labels on the cups. Pepsi was typically marked with the letter M and Coca-Cola with Q. Studies have shown that people tend to prefer items associated with certain letters over others. And subsequent controlled studies with proper scientific methodology found only modest differences between the two. None of that mattered. What mattered was the perception. The Pepsi challenge told America that when you stripped away the logos and the nostalgia and the polar bears, people preferred Pepsi, and Coca-Cola panicked. What the Pepsi challenge really accomplished was something deeper than winning a taste test. It planted a seed of doubt. For decades, Coca-Cola's dominance was built on an assumption that everyone knew Coke tastes better. The challenge said, does it though? Have you ever actually tested that? The genius was not in the result, it was in the question. Inside Coca-Cola's headquarters in Atlanta, the challenge triggered years of internal debate. The marketing team knew the data was flawed, they knew about the sip test problem. But they also knew that perception was shifting, and they had no equivalent campaign to fight back with. Coca-Cola was losing the narrative, and for a company that had controlled its own story for nearly a century, that was terrifying. The combination of declining market share, the Pepsi challenge's media coverage, and the youth migration to Pepsi created what one executive later described as a siege mentality inside the company. Something had to change. And when Roberto Goizueta said there would be no sacred cows, he meant it. Before Coca-Cola could respond to the Pepsi challenge with a new product, Pepsi launched a second front. If the challenge attacked Coke's taste, the celebrity endorsement strategy attacked its cultural relevance. In 1984, Pepsi signed Michael Jackson, not a minor celebrity, not a regional sports figure. Michael Jackson, the biggest entertainer on the planet. Jackson himself suggested using his song Billie Jean as the jingle, which tells you how embedded the deal was in his personal brand. It's on January 27, 1984, Jackson and other members of the Jacksons were filming a Pepsi commercial at the Shrine Auditorium in Los Angeles. During a simulated concert scene, the pyrotechnics malfunctioned. The sparks set Michael Jackson's hair on fire. He suffered second-degree burns to his scalp. Pepsi settled out of court for $1.5 million, roughly $4.5 million in today's money. Jackson donated the entire settlement to the Brotman Medical Center in Culver City, California, which named its burn center after him. Despite the accident, the campaign was transformative. Jackson gave Pepsi a cultural relevance that no amount of advertising could buy. Coca-Cola responded by hiring Paula Abdul, but the mismatch was obvious. In the 1980s celebrity wars, Pepsi had the advantage. The celebrity endorsement strategy extended beyond Jackson. Over the following decades, Pepsi signed Britney Spears, Beyoncé, David Beckham, and dozens of other global stars. The approach was always the same: align Pepsi with whatever cultural force was most powerful at the moment. Coca-Cola tended to create its own cultural moments, like the famous 1971 Hilltop commercial, where a multicultural group sang, "I'd like to buy the world a Coke." But Pepsi's strategy was faster, more reactive, more willing to take risks. When it worked, it generated enormous buzz. When it failed, as it did with a controversial 2017 ad featuring Kendall Jenner that appeared to trivialize protest movements, the backlash was equally enormous. By 1983, Coca-Cola's share of the American cola market had fallen to under 24%, down from 60% after the Second World War. The Pepsi challenge was working. Baby boomers were shifting to diet drinks. Younger consumers were choosing Pepsi. The trend lines were all pointing in the wrong direction. It's Roberto Goizueta, who had become CEO in 1980, told his employees there would be no sacred cows. He commissioned a secret project. It was called Project Kansas, named after a photograph of a Kansas journalist drinking a Coke that hung on several executives' walls. The result was a sweeter formula. In blind taste tests, the new recipe beat both the original Coca-Cola and Pepsi. The executives were convinced. On April 23, 1985, the Coca-Cola Company announced new Coke at a press conference at New York's Lincoln Center. Reporters had been briefed by Pepsi in advance and came prepared with hostile questions. Goizueta described the new taste as bolder, rounder, and more harmonious. There was an immediate contradiction. Previous Coke ads, featuring Bill Cosby, had praised the original's less sweet taste as a reason to prefer it over Pepsi. Now Coca-Cola was admitting, in effect, that Pepsi had been right about sweetness all along. For the first few weeks, it looked like the right call. Sales were up 8% compared to the same period the year before. Most existing Coke drinkers said they liked the new formula. Then the South responded. The backlash was unlike anything in American consumer history. Coca-Cola received over 40,000 letters and calls expressing anger and betrayal. The company hotline, 1-800-GET-COKE, was receiving 1,500 calls a day, up from 400 before the change. One letter was addressed to Chief Dodo, the Coca-Cola Company. Another asked for Goizueta's autograph, explaining that the signature of one of the dumbest executives in American business history would likely become valuable. A psychiatrist hired by Coca-Cola to listen to the calls reported that many callers sounded as if they were discussing the death of a family member. It's in the southern United States, where Coca-Cola was not just a drink, but a piece of regional identity. Some people framed the change as a surrender to the Yankees, since PepsiCo was headquartered in Purchase, New York. A columnist in Alabama, noting Goizueta's Cuban heritage, called the whole thing a communist plot. 79 days after introducing new Coke, on July 11, 1985, Coca-Cola brought back the original formula as Coca-Cola Classic. The announcement made the front page of every major newspaper. Sales surged. The conspiracy theory persists to this day that the entire episode was a deliberate strategy to boost demand for the original. Coca-Cola has always denied this. New Coke was renamed Coke 2 in 1990 and quietly discontinued in 2002. It remains the most cited cautionary tale in the history of marketing. Do not change something people love, even if the data tells you they will like the replacement better. Loyalty is not rational. It is emotional, and Coca-Cola learned that the hard way. The deeper lesson of New Coke is about the nature of brand loyalty. Coca-Cola's researchers had asked the right question. Does this taste better? The answer was yes, but they failed to ask a more important question. Does that matter? Brand loyalty is not about rational preference. It is about identity. People who drank Coca-Cola were not choosing a flavor. They were choosing a set of memories, a set of associations, a version of themselves. When you change the formula, you are not just changing a drink. You are telling millions of people that the thing they built their identity around was not good enough. That is why the backlash was so emotional. That is why people sounded like they were mourning a death. It's this insight, which Coca-Cola paid dearly to learn, has since become a foundational principle in marketing. It is the reason brands treat their logos, their packaging, their slogans with almost religious reverence. Change the product incrementally if you must, but never tell your customers that their choice was wrong. Pepsi, for its part, celebrated. The company took out a full-page newspaper ad declaring victory. They gave their employees a day off. Pepsi's president, Roger Enrico, wrote a letter to the company saying, "After 87 years of going at it eyeball to eyeball, the other guy just blinked." But the celebration was premature. When Coca-Cola Classic returned, the wave of goodwill was so powerful that it erased years of Pepsi's gains. Whatever market share Pepsi had won through the challenge and the celebrity wars was suddenly at risk. The lesson cut both ways. Coca-Cola learned not to change what people love, and Pepsi learned that your competitor's worst mistake can still end up benefiting them. 20 years after New Coke, the rivalry produced one of its strangest episodes. In 2006, a Coca-Cola employee named Joya Williams, who worked as a secretary to the company's global brand director, conspired with two accomplices to steal the Coca-Cola formula. They offered to sell it to Pepsi for $1.5 million. Pepsi did not buy. Instead, Pepsi reported the offer to Coca-Cola and to the FBI. The FBI ran a sting operation, with agents posing as Pepsi executives. Williams and her accomplices were arrested. The U.S. attorney handling the case publicly praised Pepsi, saying that if their trade secrets are violated, they all suffer, the market suffers, and the community suffers. This moment reveals something fundamental about the Coca-Cola and Pepsi rivalry. It is a war, but it has boundaries. Both companies understand an unwritten rule. The rivalry itself is the product. The competition is what keeps both brands culturally relevant. Destroying your opponent is not the goal. Outselling them is. Today, calling this a cola war is misleading. Both companies have become massive conglomerates that extend far beyond a single carbonated drink. Coca-Cola's portfolio includes Sprite, Fanta, Dasani Water, Powerade, Minute Maid, Costa Coffee, and a distribution partnership with Monster Energy. PepsiCo includes Mountain Dew, Gatorade, Aquafina, Tropicana, and Rockstar. But PepsiCo has a secret weapon that Coca-Cola does not: Frito-Lay, Doritos, Lay's, Cheetos, Tostitos. PepsiCo's snack division is what makes it the larger company by revenue, at approximately $91 billion compared to Coca-Cola's $47 billion. But in pure beverage terms, Coca-Cola still leads. The shift beyond cola accelerated in the 2000s and 2010s as both companies faced a new threat that neither could market their way out of: public health. Obesity rates were climbing. Sugar taxes were being proposed in cities and countries around the world. The core product, the thing that had started this entire rivalry, was under attack. Both companies responded by diversifying aggressively. Coca-Cola acquired Costa Coffee in 2018 for $5.1 billion, its largest acquisition ever, signaling that the future of beverages was not just about carbonated sugar water. PepsiCo had already diversified earlier and more aggressively through its Frito-Lay snack division, which by the 2020s generated more profit than the entire beverage business. The irony is that the cola wars made both companies stronger in ways that have nothing to do with cola. The competitive pressure forced both to innovate, diversify, and enter new markets faster than they would have otherwise. Sports drinks, bottled water, energy drinks, coffee, kombucha. The war that started with two pharmacists in two drugstores in the 1880s now spans virtually every beverage category on Earth. And in their cola products themselves, both companies began reformulating. Pepsi reduced sugar content in many markets starting in the 2020s, adding artificial sweeteners to comply with regulations and shifting health expectations. In 2025, Pepsi revived the Pepsi Challenge, but with a telling modification. Instead of testing the originals, they used zero-sugar versions. The battlefield had moved. It was no longer about which cola tasted sweeter. It was about which cola could survive a world that was turning against sugar itself. The rivalry continues to produce headlines. In 2019, when the Super Bowl was held in Atlanta, Coca-Cola's home city, Pepsi ran ads saying Pepsi in Atlanta. How refreshing. In 2025, Pepsi revived the Pepsi Challenge with a twist, using zero-sugar versions of both drinks. And in 2026, Pepsi aired a Super Bowl commercial featuring a Coca-Cola polar bear, choosing Pepsi over Coke. In September 2024, Sony Pictures announced a film called Cola Wars, directed by Judd Apatow and produced by Steven Spielberg. The rivalry between these two companies is now so culturally significant that it is getting its own Hollywood movie. After 130 years, neither Coca-Cola nor Pepsi has won, and that is the point. It's Coca-Cola has the stronger global brand, the wider distribution, the deeper emotional connection with consumers. Pepsi has the more diversified portfolio, the better recent marketing instincts, and the larger overall revenue when you count the snack business. But the real lesson is not about who has more market share. The lesson is that competition itself is the engine. Every time Pepsi gained ground, Coca-Cola innovated. Every time Coca-Cola seemed untouchable, Pepsi found a way to close the gap. The Pepsi Challenge forced New Coke, which accidentally proved how powerful brand loyalty really is. The celebrity wars of the 1980s redefined how companies use culture to sell products. The diversification race of the 2000s turned both companies into global food and beverage empires. 3 times, Coca-Cola had the chance to buy Pepsi and end the rivalry before it started. 3 times, they said no. It might be the best decision they never knew they were making, because without Pepsi, Coca-Cola would have had no reason to become the company it is today. And without Coca-Cola, there is no Pepsi. The underdog needs the champion needs the threat. 130 years. 2 pharmacists, 2 drugstores, and a war that made both of them stronger than either could have been alone. It's the Coca-Cola and Pepsi rivalry is not a story about cola. It is a story about competition itself, about how the presence of a worthy opponent forces you to be better, think faster, and never assume that yesterday's advantage will protect you tomorrow. Every industry has its version of this dynamic. Ford and General Motors, Apple and Samsung, Boeing and Airbus. But none of them have lasted as long or produced as many dramatic turns as the war between 2 carbonated drinks that, in a blind taste test, most people cannot reliably tell apart. That is the final irony of the cola wars. The products are nearly identical. The rivalry is everything.